20 years, more than $2 trillion in debt-financed warfare between Iraq and Afghanistan, and by some counts, as many as 170,000 lives lost total. Now the U.S. is fleeing Afghanistan, leaving that country in crisis. What happens now, especially to our allies left behind, to the women and girls who live in the country? How did this happen, and where do we go from here? To answer some of those questions, I'm glad to be joined now by Susan Glasser. She is a staff writer and columnist for The New Yorker. She has been a top executive at Politico Magazine, and Foreign Policy Magazine. Before that, she was a muckety-muck at the Washington Post. Susan, it's great to see you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Jessica.
So I've been watching the images out of Afghanistan, as have you, for hours now, in utter shock to see what's happening across the country. The capital falling, essentially, and this rushed evacuation at the airport. Did it have to be this way?
I think that's the question that we're going to be asking for many years, if not decades to come, Jessica. I mean, in a way, there's a grim inevitability to this. The U.S. has been in Afghanistan for 20 years, but hadn't really been committed to either all-out war or all-out peace. In many ways, we've been living in this sort of in-between netherworld, just enough commitment for the last few years to keep this terrible meltdown that we're seeing today from happening, but yet not enough to have changed the calculus on the battlefield. And so, I do think there was a tragic, inevitability sooner or later. Superpowers, when they leave Afghanistan, and I can say this because so many have invaded Afghanistan and come to trouble over the years, whether it was Great Britain in the 19th century or the Soviet Union in the 20th century. The shadow of outside interference hangs long over Afghanistan, and it hasn't gone well for anybody, and now that includes the United States.
I want to talk for a minute about what's happening right now and then go backwards and get some context. Right now, the U.S. Embassy has sent out security alerts about the airport taking fire, telling those folks who are at the airport to take cover. The president has ordered another 1,000 troops in. Everything right now feels very uncertain. What should we look for in the next 24 to 48 hours?
Right. So the next 48 hours, I think, are crucial. That, the question is whether they can complete the successful evacuation of the American embassy and American citizens who are in Kabul. And, as many of these Afghan interpreters and families that helped the United States military over the last 20 years. Unfortunately, that's where we see the real debacle taking hold, is the failure to have effectively planned and prepared for an orderly departure that would have included the ability to we're talking about 20,000 military interpreters by some counts, not to mention all of the brave Afghans who worked with news organizations like the Washington Post when I was there covering the war 20 years ago. And so, there's an enormous number of people, civilians, as well as foreign diplomatic personnel who seem to be crowding into Kabul International Airport. As I understand it right now, the U.S. military has taken control of the airport. All civilian airliners are shut down, and basically the United States remains in control of just this one patch of land in Afghanistan.
It's astonishing. I mean, you look at the video of what's happening in the airport, and internally, while they're controlling the airport, it looks like mayhem on the tarmac, people running, like total loss of security control internally as well. At least they're safe for now. You wrote recently that not only were there no plans to evacuate the 20,000 Afghan interpreters, but there were also no agreements secured in advance for regional bases from which to conduct counterterrorism missions that the U.S. says it needs to continue. I don't understand. Are you saying that we didn't plan for any of this?
Well, if we did plan for it, it wasn't a good plan. Let's be real. I mean, when Biden announced the drawdown in April, actually the bottom line is that really across the political spectrum, he was largely either agreed with or at least acquiesced to, right? There was very little, very vocal opposition, in part because Donald Trump had essentially said he was going to do the exact same thing, and even on a more rapid timetable. Trump's withdrawal was going to take effect as of May, whereas Biden pushed it back somewhat and said by the end of August, he was planning to withdraw everyone. Now, that doesn't mean that Biden doesn't have the responsibility for organizing or failing to organize this. And again, the Pentagon, we have so many questions. They have not been transparent about what's just gone on here, but so many questions. Is it, on the Pentagon? Is it on the White House? We don't really know the full answer yet. But the bottom line is, as I understand it, at this time, the government of Afghanistan that we supported with billions and billions of dollars has fallen today. There is no permanent new governing authority in Afghanistan. It is not now governed by a lawfully recognized entity. And the very reason that we gave, which is, well, will still be involved, but just not militarily. Well, obviously that's now disappeared because the government that we were going to remain engaged with has now collapsed, number one. Number two, we said, well, we're going to keep an ongoing counterterrorism mission in Afghanistan to make sure that it doesn't become a safe haven for Al-Qaeda or ISIS in a way that could enable them to launch attacks on American interests, which was, of course, what tragically brought us into Afghanistan in the first place. All those years ago, the 9/11 attacks were planned and carried out by Al-Qaeda, given safe haven by the Taliban inside Afghanistan. So how can we have that counterterrorism mission when, as I understand it, again, there have been negotiations and there have been talks with some of the surrounding countries that are nearby, but I don't believe that there have been any agreements reached that would enable that counterterrorism mission to function effectively right now.
Last month, President Biden said it was, quote, highly unlikely that the Taliban would soon be, quote, overrunning everything and owning the whole country. He even made a reference to Saigon, and you won't be seeing airlifted Americans from the embassy. But there has now been video of a helicopter flying over the U.S. embassy that looks a lot like the fall of Saigon. You reference, like, we don't yet know exactly what they got wrong, but was this long time coming, or is this a near-term intelligence failure?
I see a lot of people using this term intelligence failure today. And again, we need to have the full record before us before we can really understand. But it seems to me that the timing of this might have been a surprise to the administration. And obviously, it looks like it was a surprise, or they would have had 500 people at the U.S. embassy that they were evacuating today after the Taliban already marched into Kabul. And I do have a big but here, it seems pretty clear that the intelligence community, the Pentagon, very senior officials with whom I spoke at both the White House and in the military in recent months, they were under no illusions. That statement that President Biden gave in the beginning of July absolutely is not consistent with the statements that I heard privately from senior officials of the Biden administration before that period of time. And so Joe Biden was either being, hopelessly and dangerously naive with that statement, or he was simply lying. And either of those is unacceptable. And I hope that one thing that people can, see from this example, right, is that no one party has a monopoly on, truth or goodness. And, it's hard because in recent years, we've seen the excesses and the outrages of Donald Trump. And in many ways, it was Donald Trump's policy that led us right to this moment. And so, Biden, it seems to me, has a much stronger argument on the policy side of this case when it comes to Afghanistan. But he basically has no argument when it comes to how his government has handled what's gone on here. And again, just because you're not Donald Trump doesn't mean you don't have an obligation to the American public to be truthful with them and to, level with them, and also to make, competent, organized decisions.
But White House officials seem shocked by this too.
Yes. I spoke with a very senior official just the other day on Thursday, again, we're only on Sunday. This has happened so rapidly, who, said to me with a straight face, well, right now there are two credible alternatives. And this was after Herat had fallen. This was after Kandahar had fallen, the two other major cities in Afghanistan. And this official said to me, the two realistic possibilities right now are that we have a negotiated handover of power, or the Taliban marches violently into Kabul. Now, that wasn't realistic. Let's be honest. And if that person, again, a very senior official, was still genuinely thinking that on Thursday night, then again, either he was being willfully and destructively naive, or he was lying to me. Either case is wrong, right?
And just for my audience, I want to be clear that what Susan's saying is that there is no allied government in Afghanistan anymore. There is no allied partner with whom we can make deals. The Taliban's in charge, and we haven't successfully truly negotiated with them in any sort of honest broker way. Susan, do you think there's any possibility we could cut deals with the Taliban, even in the short term, for safe passage for a few days?
Well, that seems to be the goal of what we're, working on right now. It is notable, essentially that Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, chose to get on a plane today and go to Tajikistan. Now, he said in a Facebook statement posted not that long ago that he did so in order to avoid bloodshed. And then you had some Taliban officials coming into the presidential palace and giving a press conference that was just shown on Al Jazeera. Maybe that was negotiated. We don't know. We don't know the full thing. So, so far, we don't know. Are they executing people in Kabul, or are they just driving their motorcycles around and honking their horns? It's not yet clear.
Okay, this is what I want to get into next, because the Taliban has said that there won't be reprisal killings, and that they're sort of going to allow for more rights. It's sort of a kinder, gentler Taliban than the one we used to know.
Yeah, don't try that.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, I think, speaking with some of my, old longtime sources in the region who, follow this much more closely than I have in recent years, they think that not only is it not the kinder, gentler Taliban, but in some ways they're a more successful, more virulent, technology-enabled Taliban now, a far cry from the sort of medieval caliphate that was not in full control of Afghanistan, really, when the war after 9/11 began. And so, this is a disciplined fighting force that's been at it for 20 years. They've now captured all of Afghanistan barely without a fight. They've captured key amounts of very high-tech US weaponry and equipment in many different places. And so they've never given up their views about women. We are waiting to hear, what's really happened in some of the cities that they took before Kabul. We don't know. We've heard some preliminary reports of atrocities, and I think we should not be giving the benefit of the doubt to the idea that they're a kinder, gentler Taliban. That strikes me as wishful thinking, just like the deal with the Taliban that Donald Trump made in February of 2020. It was a dangerous and reckless deal, and they did not abide by the provisions, even though we largely did.
I want to come back to that deal. I'd like you to explain it to us, but first, let's go back to women and girls for a moment, because we don't see images of terrible things happening to women and girls. There's no video of that right now, but I'm talking to people I know and people in the nonprofit community or have worked with girls in Afghanistan who say they're getting texts from those who still have phones, desperate and pleading, saying that they are being taken and given to soldiers. And in the past, we know what happens then. These young girls have been subjected to just sort of routine systemic rapes by these soldiers. Can you tell me anything about what you are hearing about what might be happening in villages? And if not, what the Taliban has been known for in terms of their treatment of women and girls?
Well, so there's two issues here. One is the reports, and there have been credible reports of this kind of essentially sex slavery. This is very comparable, actually, not so much to the Taliban in the past, but to what we saw in Syria with ISIS,
right,
and Iraq with ISIS. And I think there is a great fear of that happening right now. Again, there are some credible reports. I'm told there will be, some UN human rights reporting. It may take a couple of weeks to, get more reliable, verified accounts coming out of the country now that essentially the veil of medievalism has descended upon it again. But I think it's credible and horrifying. And, we knew this was going to happen. In a big picture sense, as far as the Taliban and its attitude toward women, we are talking medieval attitudes. Imagine spending the rest of your life behind a veil of fabric and not being allowed to go to school, to work, to teach, to read, to conduct business, and to live as a member of the world community. I mean, this is a denial. Their basic fundamental views of women represent the denial of women's basic human rights. And it's shocking to me that anyone would consider recognizing a government based on those principles. Back when the Taliban governed Afghanistan, in the 1990s, only 3 countries did recognize them as the legal government of of Afghanistan for that reason, and others, and that was Pakistan, unfortunately its neighbor, which has played, unfortunately, a key role both then and now in making this happen, and then also UAE and Saudi Arabia.
I just think back to all these hours of briefings I sat through when the war started about how we were going to liberate women and they'd have schooling and it would be a whole new future. And they did for 2 decades. And it's as if it's been wiped out, reversed. I wonder if, or it looks like we're on the brink of that, if you'd speak to the Trump Taliban deal you referenced earlier. A lot of analyses, as people read about what's happened, will say that that is what set this current set of events in motion. What happened, and would you agree with that analysis?
Well, I think largely that is a correct analysis in the sense that Trump was already both drawing down forces and setting the conditions under which, the Afghan forces were not able to fight anymore. And so if the inevitable victory of the Taliban was in some ways what was agreed to in February of 2020, this was a deal, by the way, that wasn't even between our partners or our so-called partners, the Afghan national government and the Taliban. It was between the United States and the Taliban. We cut out the Afghan government and wouldn't make them a party to this because the Taliban refused to negotiate directly with them. So again, that I think is part of the hollowing out and the collapse, the complete collapse of this government. Part of it was that even we wouldn't work with them anymore. And so part of what you'll hear from the Biden people now to justify this situation as they found it is the argument that Trump had already withdrawn down to 2,500 troops, that was not sustainable, that the only reason that the Taliban was not attacking American forces was because they had this deal to leave, and that if we reneged on the deal and stayed, that US forces not only would be in danger, but that we'd actually have to ramp back up and send a lot more military personnel back into Afghanistan in order to make a difference. So again, I think that is a policy argument that we could have. I think it's a reasonable argument. I think what we haven't heard from them is any kind of plausible or reasonable defense of what they've done since April to plan and execute this withdrawal.
So can I just clarify for anybody who's not familiar with this deal, the high level conclusion of this deal that the Trump administration cut with the Taliban is that the US would exit Afghanistan decisively. Is there more to that deal that we should understand?
Yeah, correct. So the agreement was signed in February 2020. Obviously, there were a few other things, of great import going on in the United States at the time. So it did not really receive enormous attention between impeachment and pandemic and economic collapse. So the agreement said that we would leave by May of 2021. Number one. Number two, it agreed that the Afghans were to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners, many of whom have ceded the fighting force that now is used to topple the government. And in exchange, they would not seek to take territory militarily by force. Now, the Afghan would say, listen, the Taliban did not abide by that. We released these prisoners. And essentially, they never had any intention of honoring the agreement. All we did was give them time and space to organize this military assault on the country. And I think that is a pretty fair argument about what's just happened here.
To pick back up on the Trump deal, the Biden administration didn't have to accept that deal. As you say, the Taliban hadn't kept its side of the bargain, so the US could have walked away.
I think that's right. I think absolutely the US could have walked away. It could have said, well, we're going to take longer. The Taliban having the one thing that they did do was mostly not attack Americans. And by the way, another thing you would hear from the Biden people as well, we more or less successfully did withdraw down our troop presence without major incident. And you didn't hear reports in the last few months of American soldiers getting killed or, and the likewise. And so, you could say, like, we could have gone back to the Taliban and said, it's going to take longer. And, we've got the big guns and, you're going to let us do it on our terms.
Let's talk about the threat to the US, if there is one. When Bush sent troops to Afghanistan, and Iraq, he said, we'll fight them there so we don't have to fight them here at home. Suggesting that if we tamp down these terror strongholds that'll reduce the chances that we get attacked in the homeland. How has this changed the security of the homeland?
Well, interestingly, you did have Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, giving a briefing by Zoom today to members of the Senate and separately to members of the U.S. House. And he was asked that, and he acknowledged apparently on that call, according to the reports, that, of course, that the chance of al-Qaeda using Afghanistan as a safe haven has gone up because of today's events. There's, that again, you got to look that reality straight in the eye. We don't know exactly what that means yet. And that's why I mentioned the failure to have already got in place deals for a counterterrorism presence and bases in the region, if not in Afghanistan itself. I think of course, it's a real worry.
It's so hard to believe this is happening. Would you help explain when the U.S. went into Afghanistan, the Taliban was very powerful, but they didn't control all of Afghanistan, did they?
No, that's right. I mean, they had been engaged in an ongoing civil war that had been escalating actually in recent years. And so the group called the Northern Alliance, led by a very charismatic guerrilla fighter named Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was killed by al-Qaeda operatives just a couple of days before 9/11. The Northern Alliance already controlled large swaths of territory in the northern part of the country. And this was an ongoing civil war, essentially. And by the way, there has been war ongoing, not just when the United States was there, but really this goes all the way back to 1979 and the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. And essentially this poor, beautiful country with this tragic history has been fighting various iterations of this war all the way since 1979. That's not just one lifetime, multiple lifetimes of people.
We're looking at the possibility that on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, there will be a Taliban flag flying over the former US embassy in Afghanistan, over the former presidential palace in Afghanistan. Does this serve as a catalyst to other militant groups? And what kind of effect could this have on terrorists around the world?
Look, this is a good day for anybody who hates America. Let's be honest about that. It's a good day for anybody who hates America. It is a blow to American credibility and prestige around the world with our allies, by the way, as much as with our adversaries. This pullout has outraged the British, who've been quite vocal, as I'm sure you've seen today. Also, some of our other European allies who would have been willing to stick it out in a limited way in order for this disaster not to happen. And you mentioned women and girls, and I do want to go back to that because it is so important. We went to Afghanistan not in some kind of liberal crusade to make life better for the women and girls of the world. We went there for a hard-headed reason of national interest, which was to say that a terrible attack had been launched from the soil of Afghanistan on the United States, on the Pentagon, and on the World Trade Center. And yet the consequence of our going there and toppling this medieval regime was freedom for women and girls who hadn't had it. And that became a rallying cry and a cause in its own right. And I will tell you, we are children of privilege, and I don't know about you, but when I went there in the aftermath of 9/11, and I had not only no experience as a war correspondent, I don't believe that I had probably ever met someone who was illiterate, someone who certainly had been, illiterate because of the policy of the state. I met women who were my age, and at the time I was only 30 years old. I met women who were no more than a year or two older than me, who looked ancient, whose skin was, as wrinkled as sandpaper, who had, they're kept in a form essentially of modern day slavery. And, this is now happening with 20 years worth of freedom being taken away. I remember interviewing a woman in Kandahar, and I was in Kandahar in early February of 2002. That's only about a month after the Taliban were forced out of the spiritual birthplace, which is the major southern city in Afghanistan. I met a woman who had been secretly teaching underground school to girls in Kandahar for the previous 5 years. And, I'll just never forget. That's probably almost certainly one of the most courageous people I've ever talked to in my life. It's just unbearably tragic, that this is the fate to which we're subjecting women who saw a better future for themselves in the last 2 decades too.
In our last few minutes, I just want to ask about what's next. The White House, or the administration, has now sent about 5,000 US troops in, mostly, I believe, for evacuation. What are the US's options now?
They basically have very, very few. And one thing I've been surprised by is that the blame game seems to have sort of taken more precedence than actually, getting our act together. And, where's the diplomacy? I mean, where's the, not just from the United States, by the way, but from the rest of the damn world? I mean, it's really, this is the part that really is upsetting to me. I don't really want to talk today of all days about George W. Bush and Barack Obama and the surge in 2009. How about we talk about, like, there are things that international diplomats can do. They should be creating a safe corridor for refugees. They should be not only securing the airport now, they should be, working on a long-term agreement. They should be, doing any number of things to try to make this right, or at least better than it was. And I don't see many indications that that's happening, frankly. And, all we've had as far as diplomacy is this process in Doha, Qatar, overseen by Zalmay Khalilzad, the former ambassador to Afghanistan under George Bush. Donald Trump appointed him. He's the one who made this peace deal in February 2020. Why did Joe Biden keep him on? Why can we say that we accepted as credible a negotiating process with people who have clearly not turned out to be credible interlocutors? And so let's get some other diplomatic process going right now. Let's, lead a little bit, having fallen. And I don't see that happening, I have to say.
Finally, in a piece you wrote recently, someone was quoted calling this Biden's Rwanda. Other people have said, compared it to the fall of Saigon. I'm not looking to do a blame game here, but can you point us to an historical analogy?
There's so many historical analogies that, run through us. My husband and I have been talking today as we've watched in horror at this. And, kind of like with Vietnam, you wonder how much political blowback did Jerry Ford get? He was the president in 1975 during that iconic and terrible moment when the U.S. withdrew from Saigon. But of course, so many of his predecessors, Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, John F. Kennedy, had all had a role in the disaster that became the Vietnam War. To what extent did people specifically blame Ford, or did they understand, that it was a sort of tragedy with many fathers and years in the making? I think that's sort of the situation here as well. Joe Biden certainly will be accountable to history for what he's done in failing to manage the withdrawal, but he's obviously not the architect of this failure in a big picture historical sense. So I do think about Vietnam in this case. There are worst case scenarios. That person I quoted was wondering whether this would become Biden's Rwanda, not saying that it has. And in that analogy, the fear, of course, would be if there are massive atrocities that result from the Taliban takeover. Another fear is of a kind of Benghazi or Tehran embassy type situation where there would be hostages taken or American casualties. So these are all possible still. This crisis is not over.
I wish there were a happier note to end on. I'm deeply grateful for your time today. Thanks for explaining this and sitting with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica.